Hopes of a rate cut, fears of another anti-Semitic attack. The election year begins with intense debate over the economy and national security. The man who would be Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, is our guest this morning. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders for 2025. They're the two big issues that dominate elections, the economy and security, and both came into sharp focus on Wednesday. News broke of a caravan found on Sydney's outskirts containing explosives and anti-Semitic notes. After a summer of escalating attacks on the Jewish community, Peter Dutton is blaming Anthony Albanese for not doing enough to stamp out the threat. On the same day, better than expected inflation news gave the government hope struggling households will be feeling more positive in time for the election. Chances of an interest rate cut in the coming weeks have grown. Labor reckons its strategy on the economy has worked.
Okay. Everyone good?
Jim Chalmers is out today with a big grin on his face.
Now we are just moments away from the latest quarterly inflation figures.
The trim mean has fallen to 3.2%.
Even weaker than the market predicted.
So this again will create more of a condition for the Reserve Bank to cut rates.
The worst of the inflation challenge is now well and truly behind us.
Well, only the Treasurer thinks that the prices of everything are under control. Only the Treasurer thinks that. Australians don't think that.
These numbers are better than expected and better than forecast.
This is not mission accomplished. Inflation has remained too high for too long.
What I'm concerned about is the real issues facing Australians, that's cost of living and making sure that we continue the path on which we're on.
I don't think the government's got too much to crow about. I really hope that interest rates come down as quickly as possible.
The focus tonight on the Reserve Bank, with an interest rate decision 20 days away.
It is good news. There are economists around the country saying cut, baby, cut.
I'd be highly surprised if the Reserve Bank didn't cut rates at their next meeting.
Now, I respect the independence of the Reserve Bank too much to try and make predictions or to give them free advice.
Do you expect the RBA to cut rates now?
If we get a cut, that's not going to restore Australia's standard of living.
It's not for me to give free advice to the independent Reserve Bank.
I don't get into giving free advice to the Reserve Bank Governor.
And we get a lot of free advice.
We need a change. We need a back-to-basics economic approach to get our economy back on track.
The biggest risk to inflation and the cost of living and the economy in 2025 is Peter Dutton and a coalition government. Thanks very much.
My guest this morning is Opposition Leader Peter Dutton. First, let's check what's making news. The government's contentious nature-positive laws have been shelved ahead of Parliament resuming. Perth's Sunday Times has reported, and we've since confirmed, Labor won't proceed with the plans for a new federal Environment Protection Authority before the election. The move was being fiercely resisted by West Australian Premier Roger Cook after fresh efforts by Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek to find a compromise solution. In the Nine newspapers, the New South Wales Premier has defended not telling the Prime Minister about a secret police investigation into the caravan of explosives found in Dural in Sydney's northwest. Chris Minns says he was told by police it was a joint operation with their federal counterparts. News Corp papers are running with the opposition leader's calls for an independent inquiry into the issue. The Prime Minister has not revealed when he was told. Meanwhile, the Nine papers report neo-Nazis are thriving on Elon Musk's X platform. I'll ask Peter Dutton about that. And finally, David Crowe reports the opposition leader made a private pledge to review the so-called golden ticket visa for wealthy investors while talking to a migration agent at a Liberal Party fundraiser. The visa was scrapped by Labor. A video recording shows Mr Dutton saying he thinks he'll bring it back. Well, Parliament is back tomorrow for a two-week sitting, and it could well be the last before the election. There are some bills the government still hopes to pass, and we'll get to those. But this fortnight will largely be used by Labor to highlight the economic choice at this election. It wants to warn voters their household budgets would be worse off under the coalition. For his part, the opposition leader is sticking with a broad economic pitch. His focus will be national security and warning voters the Prime Minister is making Australia less safe. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Laura Tingle, Phil Curry and Claire Armstrong. Very good morning to all of you.
Welcome back.
And a happy new year. Look, we'll get to the escalating problem of those anti-Semitic attacks a bit later. I want to start, though, on cost of living. Cosy Lives has been, as we've discussed many times, the biggest issue over the last term of Parliament. It's been an incumbent killer around the world as well in the elections that we've seen overseas. Laura, in that context, how significant were those inflation numbers on Wednesday?
They're really significant, David. They were significant economically as well as politically. I mean, we've got a very, very soft economy. It's avoided a technical recession, though households are in recession, which tends to get overlooked in all this discussion. So, the Reserve Bank needed signs, not just that the physical numbers were getting down into that band that they're looking for of 2 to 3%, but that inflation trends were heading down. Now, there are still a couple of stubborn things. Rents are one and insurance are another. But the sorts of things the bank has to think about when it's considering interest rates are whether keeping interest rates higher will actually stop will bring those down any further, and they'll be worried about whether wages will take off if they reduce rates. Now, there's a big debate about the strength of the labour market and things, but I think in terms of interest rates, it's a very significant number. Politically, we can talk about that, but also it does suggest that the pressures on households prices aren't dropping.
No.
This is a problem, but...
They're still going up, but not as...
Prices are not rising and continuing to just, agitate people as much as they did.
Yeah, look, take a look at the story here on inflation. I mean, you can see how it spiked and has steadily been coming down over recent months, both the headline rate in red and the trimmed mean, that underlying rate that's more important for the Reserve Bank. The Treasurer's point this week was all about, well, our strategy, the soft landing approach has worked. He's talking about this figure on unemployment. You can see compared to other countries, Australia's the yellow line. Canada, New Zealand had much higher spikes and maintained higher levels of unemployment. The US has done pretty well throughout when it comes to unemployment. But Phil, does this result we're seeing with inflation now coming down pretty close back to the target zone, does it vindicate the approach taken by the government in keeping spending going to keep the economy ticking over?
Oh, outwardly at least, yes, because they can, governments get blamed for a lot of things that they can't control. So I think they're entitled to also claim, what happens under their watch. And, the numbers have all come together at probably the best possible time in the political cycle. All those key inflation, unemployment, maybe interest rates all heading in the right direction. So I guess yes, I think yes, he can claim vindication.
But the flip side would be
whether it was his work or not.
Yeah, well, the flip side would be if they'd cut spending more, maybe we would have got inflation down earlier, but arguably we would have had higher unemployment, possibly recession along the way.
That's right, and the government argues that its cost of living assistance was, non-inflationary, like the power bill discounts and stuff like that. So their narrative has all come together. It's all come together quite tidily at an opportune time for them. So, I think they were very happy this week. I think I saw Anthony Albanese on the ABC on Tuesday. He almost fell through the TV screen. He was so excited on Wednesday it was, after those inflation numbers. But they have to be careful though, because and they're being careful. They're not saying mission accomplished. Actually. But it's a sentiment they need to ride now. They want people to feel things are now, we're through the worst. I think the PM said in an interview with us on the weekend, we're at the beginning now of a good period. So it's sort of stick with Labor and it's going to get better from here.
Well,
that's what they need. They want voters to feel more charitable towards them.
And do they, Claire? That's the question. Are people feeling it at the moment? The numbers might look better, but people are still hurting and there's not a lot of time before the election.
Yeah, well, Jim Chalmers talks about the soft landing, and I think, as has been covered in the labour market and even in the economy in terms of not going into a recession, it's a pretty strong case for they having stuck the soft landing. Households is a different story. What I think the government, and I think the government is not unaware of that. They know that people are still paying enormously more at the checkout and for their mortgages right now than they were 3 years ago. What they're hoping, I think, is that with this mood shift or this view that this year is going to be better, it will broaden the conversation around cost of living in a way that will help Labor in the election. So it's not so much about immediate hip pocket relief. It's a broader bread and butter structural reforms, things like GP bulk billing or fee-free TAFE, those kinds of longer-term measures that obviously have cost of living impacts, and essentially hadn't necessarily cut through as much over the last 3 years.
Talk about
people
cut
are so
through.
worried about.
An interest rate cut is always something that cuts through. Everyone notices it gets plenty of coverage. You see it in your bank balance and so on. And the Reserve Bank Board meets 2 weeks from Tuesday, February 18. Government obviously isn't publicly pronouncing what it thinks should happen, but we all know what it would like to happen, and that is a rate cut. Raises the prospect that even at the end of that week, the Prime Minister might decide it's time to call an election, and it could be called for March 29 or even April 5th, I think it is. You'd have a bit of overlap with the West Australian election of a week or two, because the West Australian election is
March 8.
March 8. Is that a realistic prospect now that this firms up the timing?
Look, I don't think the Prime Minister's made up his mind, and he's the only one who gets to do it. I think he's got a whole heap of options now, with the prospect of an interest rate cut. They think that the budget will help them. They'll do that. They can announce more measures in the budget. But
would the budget help them?
Well, I don't think... Look, I think the whole impact of the budget in reality is wildly overplayed all the time. I don't think it necessarily matters either way. But politicians do see an opportunity for a platform, and they like that idea. And I think... but the point is, whatever they're announcing, it'll be essentially election promises in terms of new measures. Which he can do during a campaign. Which he can do during a campaign. So they don't need to do a budget. But I think he has increasingly sort of backed himself into this position of saying, I want to serve a full term. Yeah. And so and he doesn't want to get mixed up with March 8, as those headlines about Nature Positive show. So I don't know, but I mean, my logic would suggest that he would want to be clear of that and would still go after the West Australians.
You could do a little bit of overlap. I mean, given the WA election result is a foregone conclusion. I mean, the coalition, the Liberals only have 2 seats. I think the Nationals have 4. Yeah. And given the propensity of people now to pre-poll, if he called the federal election with a week to go in WA, I think you'd still be pretty safe, wouldn't you, from backlash? And
surprisingly, both sides are saying that the coalition isn't doing as well in the West as they were expecting to do. They're not quite sure why, but they certainly don't seem to be making the inroads. And you're not just getting that automatic snapback from the strong result last time.
One of the measures that we're expecting to see, whether it's in the budget or during the campaign, will be another round of energy bill relief for the next financial year. I did talk after the inflation figures and how the Reserve Bank's going to approach this decision on February 18 to Lucy Ellis, former Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, now Chief Economist at Westpac. Asked her about this idea of another round of energy bill relief, whether it's warranted.
With the energy rebates, one of the aspects that we have to be aware of is that once those unwind, the cost of electricity that people will pay will go up quite a bit. And so, I can certainly imagine that governments would want to maybe keep extending that a bit until we kind of catch the downswing.
Yeah, you can catch the full conversation there with those QR codes. Really interesting analysis on how the Reserve Bank will approach this decision. But energy bill relief, Claire, you'd think they're going to do it, and there is an argument for doing it.
Yeah, certainly you don't want to be heading into an election with the opposition able to point out that, I mean, energy bills were down about 9.9% in the year to December in the latest data. ABS says they would have gone up 0.2% without that. Not just there's been some state initiatives as well, but obviously the federal money. Also, the RBA has priced in, because there's that funding cliff at the moment, they're assuming that there'll be a correction in the inflation figures going up to about 3.7 potentially. So you also don't want to have that conversation that Labor have potentially put the country in a situation where there's not opportunity for a rate cut later in the year.
It'll probably be a good wedge too. They'll use it as a wedge, because if you go back to that speech Mr Dutton gave in early January, the campaign rally in Chisholm, where he said we're not going to get caught with Labor in an arms race of cost of living assistance. He described these, what he called Panadol measures. He said the objective has to get the fundamentals right, get inflation down, get everything down, sort of old school economic management, if you like. So if Labor were to trundle out another round of power bill discounts going into the election, it would set up a flashpoint, and they're trying to weave this narrative that life would be worse off than had the coalition been in power, so I suspect there will be a little flashpoint there.
Well, time to talk to the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, and to take us there, he was the Treasurer, defending the spending that he says has kept the economy ticking over.
What these numbers show is we've been able to achieve something that other countries cannot, which is to make this remarkable progress on inflation at the same time as we maintain the gains we've made in the labour market and keep the economy ticking over. Now, the economic and often the political orthodoxy and what we've seen play out in other countries is that you have to pay for much lower inflation with much higher unemployment.
Peter Dutton, welcome to the program.
Morning, David.
So you've blamed the government for this inflation problem because they've been, as you say, spending like drunken sailors. So would you cut spending?
Well, David, just to put it into perspective, the government spent an extra $347 billion and, I mean, don't take my word for it in terms of the impact. The Reserve Bank Governor has been very clear that it has fuelled inflation. She's referred to homegrown inflation, and as we know in the US, the UK, New Zealand and Canada, interest rates have already come down, and there is a lot of work still to do in the economy here. I want to see interest rates come down as quickly as possible because Labor's cost of living crisis is really hurting families and small businesses. And we do want to see inflation dealt with. We want to see interest rates come down, and the Reserve Bank Governor ultimately will make the decisions that she sees according to the economic settings that are relevant to her decision. But there's a long way to go before the government can start claiming that families are much better off.
Sure. Look, to be clear, the Reserve Bank Governor did also say public demand's not the main game. But back to the question, would you cut spending?
Well, where we see wasteful spending, yes, we would. And putting an additional 36,000 public servants into Canberra at a cost of over $6 billion a year recurring expenditure, which is exactly the formula that Stephen Miles and Anastasia Palaszczuk had in Queensland and that Daniel Andrews and Jacinta Allen have adopted in Victoria. It sent those two economies through the floor, and it's a recipe to try and please the unions, not to try and drive government efficiency. So where there's inefficiency, yes, we supported the government in changes that they made to the NDIS because they acknowledged that there was money there that wasn't being appropriately spent, and we supported those changes through the Senate, which has made it a more sustainable scheme for those who are most in need.
Look, I guess every opposition does talk about cutting waste, finding more efficiencies. Fair enough, that has to be done. But the question is whether total spending, government spending, needs to be lower to get inflation down further.
Well, look, our desire is to manage the economy successfully, as my predecessors in John Howard, for example, did. When John Howard came into government, there was a mess to clean up. After the Hawke-Keating years, he cleaned it up and managed the economy successfully. And that's exactly the formula that I want to apply. I want to make sure that we can provide further support. We've announced further support for training places for doctors, for Medicare services around mental health, etc. So the frontline services we want to bolster, and we want to make sure that that is being delivered because people are hurting. And the Band-Aid fixes the government's got at the moment with energy relief. The fact is people's power bills have gone up by $1,000. Food's up by 12%. Electricity's up by 32%. Rents are up by 17%. So if the government's pretending that somehow they've performed this miracle, the economy's turned around and families should be grateful, I just don't think that's the discussion around family tables at the moment.
No, but this is a question about what you would do to fix all these problems. So again, would you actually lower spending, or is your approach to the economy not necessarily to lower spending?
Well, if we find wasteful spending, our intent is to cut it, and that will result in obviously an overall reduction in government expenditure. And if you're saving $24 billion plus over the forward estimates with the public servants, that's money that you can either use to pay off debt or you can use to put downward pressure on inflation. And that's how we help people. There are 27,000 small businesses who have closed in the last 2.5 years. Tell them that everything's going well.
Well, that's interesting. So you will save $24 billion by cutting all of those additional public servants in Veterans Affairs, in Defence and NDIA and so on.
There are 36,000 additional places that have been put on. I made the point in my speech on Friday that we protect frontline positions, but we're not going to allow the public service to balloon. It's exactly what happened in the Rudd-Gillard period, although I might say by not as much. It has dramatically increased under the Albanese government. And again, it's to please the unions. It's not to provide a more efficient delivery of services. I don't think any Australian can say that their lives are easier in terms of their interactions with government agencies because of 36,000 new public servants being employed in Canberra.
Well, there might be some veterans who are happy to see the backlog cleared and get their pension, but just again, are you going to cut all of those 36,000 public servants?
We are going to. We've said, David, and we've been very clear. We are not going to have the public service sitting at over 200,000 on Labor's projections. It wasn't that in the Rudd-Gillard years, and it's obvious that there's a correlation between a bloated service and a lack of productivity. The other aspect too, I might say, is that you're drawing people from the most productive parts of the economy to put them into lesser productive parts of the economy, and that is not helping our productivity problem at the moment. It's exacerbating it, and Labor just can't manage money. They can't manage the economy, and that's exactly why families are in the problem that they're in at the moment.
Would you have a spending audit like Tony Abbott did when he came in, the Tony Shepherd audit?
We're not having a similar style audit, but many of us have sat around the Expenditure Review Committee. I was Assistant Treasurer to Peter Costello many years ago. We know what we're doing. We're able to hit the ground running, and we've worked with the departments, with many of the departmental heads that are there now, and I have no doubt that we'll be able to find where Labor has put fat into the system that is not helping do anything but drive inflation. And I want to bring inflation down, because it's not just mortgage rates, as I say, it's every time people turn up to pay their grocery bill. They're taking items out of the basket, out of the trolley at the moment, and not putting them through the scanner because they can't afford their power. They can't afford their grocery bills or their power bills or their insurance bills under this government.
So not an independent audit, but you do your own. You'd run the ruler over all the spending yourselves. So we may not know until after the election where you'd cut.
We need to sit down and look through an ERC process, which would be the normal course of things. We'll do that in government. But as we know, Labor can't help but tax and spend, and that's why they're seeking to tax an unrealised capital gain in superannuation.
What about a further round of energy bill relief, if that's announced before the election? Would you support that or oppose it?
Well, David, the question is, and the threshold for us is it inflationary? So, as was pointed out before in the interview that you had, or the clip of that interview, there has been a temporary relief because of the band-aid fix that the government put in place. If it's fuelled inflation and it's just kept people's mortgage rates higher for longer, then that becomes counterproductive. Because, as I say, you can promise $275 reduction for a period before the election, then never mention it again. But people's electricity bills are up by $1,000, and we need to have some longer-term relief as well as the short-term relief, and so we'll judge it by that criteria.
Well, what do you think, though, of the previous rounds?
Well, inflation stayed high. That's the reality. Core inflation is still a problem, and if it wasn't, interest rates would have come down by now. And as I say, in comparable jurisdictions, in comparable economies, they have come down. That's the big difference.
But underlying inflation, core inflation, has come down.
Well, core inflation's come down. That's a good thing, but it hasn't come down to within the target range, and that's why interest rates have stayed higher for longer because of Labor's spending.
So, look, under your energy plans, would power bills over the next decade, before we get the first nuclear plant online, over the next 10 years, would power bills be lower?
Well, there are 2 points to make here. Access Economics did a lot of work and were a great organisation in their day, but Frontier Economics, I think, is the most preeminent body today in terms of energy modelling. They look at our energy policy compared to Labor's. They judge that it's 44% cheaper than Labor's policy. Importantly, Frontier do a lot of work for Labor in government, and they've done it for South Australia, they've done it for the federal government. Since that report has been released, the Treasurer, the Energy Minister, the Prime Minister have not punched any holes in the assumptions or the conclusions drawn from that report. So that's the independent analysis in terms of what the price impact will be. Between now and when our policy rolls out, there are 2 points to make. One is that we're not overbuilding the system like Labor is. So the 28,000 kilometres of poles and wires, which cost tens and tens of billions of dollars, are not required under our model. That is being felt in and priced into power bills today and over the next decade. And secondly, we have a lot to do in the short term, I think particularly in relation to gas and peaking, to provide support. State governments are signing up to an extension of the life of the coal-fired power stations because they realise the lights are going off without that. So yes, power prices will be cheaper than under us in the near term, as well as in the medium to longer term as well.
Okay, but the Frontier report you talked about, that 44% lower cost is the cost of building it over the, between now and 2050. It didn't say anything about the price impact. You've just said prices will be lower over the medium term. Where are you getting that from?
Well, David, if you're delivering a system that's 44% cheaper, or if you look at the US modelling, what they've done in their international or in their nuclear energy agency there, they say about 37%. So it's of that order. If you're delivering a model that's 44% cheaper, that translates into cheaper power prices. Part of the reason people are paying so much for their electricity bills, we're paying 3 times at the moment for an electricity bill compared to, say, Tennessee or Ontario, where they do have nuclear firming up renewables. We can't do business. There's been a 3-fold increase in the number of manufacturing business closures over the course of the last 2.5 years. And I say 27,000 small businesses are closing. In part, that's because even though we've got an abundance of natural resource, we're paying the highest energy costs, the highest electricity costs in the world.
So how much cheaper will power prices be? This is what households want to know.
Well, again, if you apply the economics, so if there's a 44% reduction in the model of delivering an energy system, you would expect a 44% reduction or of that order being passed through in energy bill relief. Now, that comes in
the next 10 years?
Not pretending that comes in tomorrow. Our first investment in nuclear, or the first plant, and as we say, we've got 2 in the flagship, which is the most efficient and effective way to deliver the rollout of nuclear. It comes in 2035 to 2037. And in the interim, we're going to have to do a lot more with gas, with coal in the system, as I say, for longer under Labor, and making sure that we don't have to overbuild as Labor is doing now, which will drive up prices over the next decade. All
right, but Frontier didn't tell you that number. You're just drawing that assumption yourself?
Well, again, David, I mean, that's the economics of it. If you're all other variables being equal, if you have a 44% reduction in the overall cost to deliver that model, that is going to translate into that price reduction for households and for businesses, and that's what we must do. We have to lower the input cost of energy in our country because we have a high wage cost compared to Malaysia or compared to the United States or our other competitor nations, and this is the one input cost that we could bring down. Instead, we're now presiding over a system where we've got blackouts and brownouts, and we're being told that that's part of our life. Well, business doesn't operate in that uncertainty, neither do ICU units at hospitals, neither does cold storage at the local butcher or supermarket, and we can't have intermittent power pretending that we can run a modern, advanced economy.
All right, look, I want to leave that energy debate because there's a few other things I want to get to. The anti-Semitism, the attacks that we've seen escalating in Australia, you've described this as a clear campaign of terror and a national crisis. Do you think the terror threat level should be increased?
Well, that's a matter for ASIO. I wrote to the Prime Minister in November of 2023 saying that we needed to have a national cabinet because the police commissioners and the police ministers needed to hear, along with the premiers and chief ministers, a very clear message from their Prime Minister that we had zero tolerance for these anti-Semitic attacks, and it was entirely predictable. We saw the protests 2 days after October 7 on the steps of the Opera House, and the Prime Minister has been weaving all over the road on this issue, and I think because of that lack of national leadership, we have seen a predictable escalation, and I worry that people are going to lose their lives, and I think the Prime Minister needs to start taking this seriously.
Have you requested a briefing with the ASIO boss about this?
I've spoken with Mike Burgess. We've had briefings from both the Federal Police and from ASIO. I find it astounding that the Prime Minister, it seems, didn't find out for 7 or 8 or 9 days after Premier Minns found out. And Premier Minns, in conversations with the Prime Minister, including a visit to the childcare centre which had been attacked, clearly was told not to raise it with the Prime Minister. It's inconceivable that in all of those conversations Premier Minns would have had with the Prime Minister, that the discussion wouldn't have come up. And if the Premier was told by the New South Wales Police not to raise it with the Prime Minister, why? I don't think there's been a true and honest account of what's happened here. But if the Prime Minister of our country is not across what was potentially the biggest terrorist attack in our country's history, essentially until the public found out about it, I think that is an absolute abrogation of his responsibility, and we do, I think, deserve to hear the answers.
Well, the Prime Minister has not said when he found out. Have you spoken to Mike Burgess since this incident, or indeed the Federal Police boss, Rhys Kershaw?
No, we've had James Patterson and our people have had briefings in relation to it. I've spoken, and I'm not going to go into the private details of text messages I've had with Mike Burgess, but I know this space very well, David, and I can't believe that the Prime Minister hasn't been informed. I can't believe... I suspect what has happened here, if I'm being honest, is that the New South Wales Police have been worried about the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office leaking the information, which is the only explanation. Otherwise, it's inexplicable that the Premier of New South Wales would have known about this planning, this likely terrorist attack with a 40-metre blast zone, and he's spoken to the Prime Minister over 9 days but never raised it, never discussed it. I mean, if he knew that the Prime Minister wasn't aware, wouldn't he have raised it with him? And I just think Premier Minns and the Prime Minister need to give an honest account of what they knew, when and why the Prime Minister wasn't briefed. It would have been the instinct of the AFP Commissioner to brief the Minister and the Prime Minister, as it was when I was Home Affairs Minister, and it's inconceivable that the Prime Minister could credibly say that he didn't know for 9 days about this.
Look, he hasn't said that, just to remind people that he's not said when.
Well,
when
why wouldn't he say when he was briefed? Premier Minns has been prepared to do so.
Look, more broadly, how would you stop these anti-Semitic attacks?
Well, there should have been from day one, David, a very clear message that we don't tolerate racism and anti-Semitic conduct, whether it's by neo-Nazi nut jobs or whether it's by the left wing of crazy organisations on campuses. For months and months and months, people were protesting against Jewish students, against Jewish academics. To this very day, the universities haven't given a proper account of how that was allowed to continue on. The Prime Minister did nothing about it. The marches on the streets that went on for months and months, waving flags of terrorist organisations, all of that allowed people to believe that there was no red line that could be crossed and there's no consequence. We've said that there should be zero tolerance, that there should be mandatory sentencing for people convicted of terrorist offences, and that I would have absolutely no tolerance, and I would convey that in the most certain terms to the AFP Commissioner and ASIO and the other agencies, to stamp it out. And the Prime Minister hasn't done that because he's seeking the votes of Green voters in inner city Sydney and Melbourne and southwestern Sydney. He's been driven by political motivation here, and I think it is a disgrace.
None of the arrests that have been made over anti-Semitic incidents in Australia so far have been visa holders. They've all been Australian citizens. What does that tell you? Is this a homegrown problem?
Well, it's a combination of things, I'm sure. As Mike Burgess would point out, a young person sitting in front of a computer screen can be indoctrinated over a week or two because of the constant videos and bombardment of propaganda. So there's obviously the influence of social media. There's the influence of people who are radicalised here in our own society. Some of them may be visa holders, they may be third-generation Australians. They may have been here for much longer or much shorter, who knows? And no doubt ASIO will have a better picture of who some of those people are, but the point is that it is a serious issue. We went first from protests and doxing online and at universities, and then there were fire bombings, now a planned terrorist attack. And if we think it's going to stop there, we're kidding ourselves, and that's why the Prime Minister, with his first duty of responsibility to take care of Australians, has failed so dismally.
You mentioned social media, though. What about the responsibility of Elon Musk on his X platform, where a lot of this anti-Semitism and neo-Nazi stuff is thriving? Does he bear some responsibility?
Well, I've had a battle for over a decade against people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and others who are making money out of our kids. And they need to do it in a responsible way. All of us spend a lot of time online and our kids are on their devices constantly. The same rules should apply online as they do in the real world. And if there's child abuse material, which I've tried for years to get Facebook to take down, if there is that sort of explicit material, if there is terrorist-related advocacy and spreading of that hate message, they have the algorithms, they have the technology and now the AI to be able to clear it. But of course they don't, because they're driven by profit. So yes, of course it should be taken down.
A couple of things just quickly with Parliament coming back. The government's plans for tax credits for critical minerals and rare earths. Will you support that or vote against it?
No, we've been clear that, and speaking to a lot of leaders, business leaders in WA, people don't think it's going to have the impact that the government's predicting. What people are worried sick about in WA at the moment is the nature positive laws, which have been kept secret. If they were so good for WA, the Prime Minister would have had it out there and been proud, waving it around, saying this is great.
Do you welcome the fact they've been shelved?
Well, instead now, people in WA, if they're voting for Anthony Albanese at the next election, they know that they'll get nature positive laws after the election from a Albanese bant Labor Greens minority government. That would be a disaster for the WA economy and mining sector, and therefore a disaster for our national economy as well.
Will you do a deal with the government on electoral donation reform?
Well, we've been in discussion, as you know, with the government in relation to that bill. No agreement has been arrived at, but we'll conduct the discussions in good faith, and we'll make any announcement in due course.
And what did you make of the announcement on Friday from the Health Minister of an inquiry into gender treatment for children and adolescents? Do you support this sort of inquiry, or do you share the concerns of Tony Abbott this is going to stop states from banning puberty blockers for the next year and a half?
Well, we welcome the inquiry. I note that we don't know yet the terms of reference. We don't know who's being appointed to conduct the review, and it's due to report back in mid-2026. So there are some caveats, and sure, the government. I'm sure the government will release that detail shortly, unless it's just a stunt. But equally, the states here have their own constitutional rights, which is why Queensland and WA, Liberal and Labor administrations have made decisions in relation to these matters, and I think their decision should stand, and the inquiry can be conducted simultaneously. But if the government's just trying to sort of cauterise an issue before the election, which I suspect is what they're trying to do, and just park it, then I think this is a more serious issue than that needs to be given proper consideration, and hopefully it will during the course of the inquiry.
So that Queensland ban on new treatments for those under 18 should still be allowed to go ahead?
Yeah, that is a decision of the state governments, and the state governments have a right, as the federal government does, where it has jurisdiction to make their decisions according to the basis on which they've been elected. So, and as you say, similarly for the Labor government in WA.
Opposition Leader Peter Dutton, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks for joining us on this first show of the election year.
Thanks, David. Take care.
All right, we are going to get to those anti-Semitic attacks and this argument over who knew what when, what needs to happen now. First, let's just get back to the panel on some of this. Laura Tingle, Phil Curry and Claire Armstrong. Just want to circle back to that spending discussion. Laura, clear there, do you think that there will be lower spending under the coalition, even if the details won't be worked out until after?
No, I don't think it's at all clear. I mean, I'm sort of sitting here a little bit agog, this idea that they're going to announce their spending cuts after the election. Now, just keep in mind the record of the coalition and opposition. In 2010, they put up a series of spending proposals which ended up looking like cooked books when they were investigated by Department of Finance and Treasury, when there was a hung parliament, and as a result didn't get into government. In 2013, they made a whole heap of promises that they broke. They don't have a great amount of credibility here, and now we've got a position where the coalition, a couple of months from the election, still hasn't outlined a lot of generic policies, and they're saying that in terms of spending cuts, they're going to announce them after the election.
And it's going to be, Phil, not an independent, Tony Shepherd audit.
No, they got him into trouble last time.
Yeah, well, just remind people who may not recall what happened there.
Well, Tony Abbott promised him, if elected, to have a commission of audit, and they got Tony Shepherd and Peter Crone.
They did a thorough job.
Very thorough job of where we can save money, and there's still a lot of good ideas in that thing, like getting rid of the National Capital Authority, but I digress.
Town Barons will get it.
But the trouble is, it was the run-up to that now notorious 2014 budget, and the government at the time didn't have the opportunity to sell the case for these cuts because they had to have a fresh Senate election in WA, if you remember. So we had that 2014 budget, and to this day, the Labor's still dragging out that line against Peter Dutton because it had the $7 Medicare co-payment in it, which sort of just fell from the sky on budget day. So
anyway, he's not going to go down that path.
He's not going to go down that path.
And a lot of the things they cut, I'm pretty sure, weren't actually in the audit anyway. They were just something they'd pulled out of the bottom drawer.
But anyway, he'll control his own decision making.
It's clear the public service is in the coalition's sights, and the language of some of their front benches have been a little mixed over recent times, Claire, about whether they would cut the public service or be more efficient in the public service or stop the growth. I think Jane Hume said this morning in the public service. Peter Dutton did seem to say they'll cut it.
Yes, he's obviously trying to carve out the sort of frontline service workers, obviously things like processing veteran claims. But it's worth noting that an audit of the last year of the Morrison government found that there was about 54,000 consultants sort of doing essentially a lot of public service work at a cost of about $20 billion. So there's obviously just a lot of manpower required to go into the machinery of government, and it's not quite as simplistic to just say you can slash and burn from the public sector.
And it's not, and when the use of the word consultant sort of confuses people. I think it sort of suggests that they're experts in areas. Defence had tens of thousands of people basically doing bureaucratic jobs, but being employed as subcontractors, often through the now rather discredited Big Four accounting firms. It was basically a way of taking public servants off the books, and by putting them back on the books, Labor has actually saved money because it's cheaper.
Now,
just quickly, Dave, but I mean, before the election campaign, they will still have to release their costings, right? So they'll have to, the coalition will have to give some indication of, it may not be the details, but it'll have to be how the budget's going to look under them. That's a staple of the election campaign. So there'll have to be some sort of sign about where they're heading and what they're going to spend and not spend.
I might park the energy debate because there's a whole lot there about whether prices will be lower. We will come back to that in future programs. But the anti-Semitism, just to go through what's happened this week, we found out on Wednesday that this caravan had been found in Dural in northwest Sydney, explosives inside, notes as well, addresses apparently, and a picture of the couple that were arrested didn't particularly look like masterminds of this, and police have made it clear they're trying to find the puppet masters. They'd found it 10 days earlier. They hadn't gone public with it. The opposition was critical of that. The local member, Glen Le Lievre, reckons police should have been more public about it.
The police should let the public know about their investigations as soon as it's practicable, particularly if the public can assist with the investigations and people in the local community. I represent the area where the caravan was found in Dural in northern Sydney. In order to ensure the local community is safe, I think people do have a right to know.
The police, however, said this was a covert investigation that was still underway, and they wanted it to remain, well, covert.
This has been an investigation, a covert investigation, an investigation that requires us to go about our business without compromising investigation. The fact that this information is now in the public domain has compromised our investigation, and it's been detrimental to some of the strategies we may have used.
All right, well then the opposition really shifted their focus, Claire, to whether the Prime Minister knew about this or not. Is it clear whether he did know?
Well, he's obviously taken a principled stance of just not answering the question at all. There's plenty of reporting around, citing different police and even state government sources, that the federal government essentially only really found out about this as it became public, that was a conscious decision.
And why would that be? Why would they not inform the feds?
Well, my understanding is, for example, the AFP didn't feel that it met the threshold for what would normally be reporting to the Attorney General, or therefore the Prime Minister, that there was not an ongoing threat.
This is the theory, that there was no detonator, that it therefore was more about the scare of having the caravan.
Yeah, I think that's an element of it, but I also, obviously, over the course of their initial investigation, they didn't feel that there was the sudden need to elevate this in. They obviously felt, that they could get more policing done in terms of the investigation without everyone being aware that the police were looking potentially into them, and also that it wasn't necessary to have that public awareness. I mean, at the same time, it's difficult. You can appreciate Glen Le Lievre's point of view there, where he is representing a community that is very rightly anxious about their safety situation and feel that they deserve to have as much information as possible. I think there actually seems to have been some kind of, whether it's deliberate or otherwise, I don't know, a breakdown in communication over how this became.
Well, you heard Peter Dutton, Phil, say there that he suspects the cops were worried about the Prime Minister's office leaking. I don't know why the Prime Minister's office would leak something like this, but and that would be a very serious problem if it were true. There is no evidence of that. No. But is there a problem here for the PM? Does he need to explain when he knew, or are they just trying to keep this alive?
Well, there's two things here. I mean, I can understand if the coppers are cranky it's got out, because we don't know what's going on. We're not qualified, but if they felt revealings would jeopardise their investigation because they're trying to catch the mastermind, I think they're entitled to be cranky about that. But yeah, had the Prime Minister been informed, it still wouldn't have got out anyhow. And I mean, it's not the Prime Minister's fault if he wasn't told. Yeah. You know, it looks bad. It looks bad from a number of areas, you know, from whichever perspective you look at it. But I don't think you can blame him for not being told.
And he has, Anthony Albanese has certainly strengthened his language in relation to all of the anti-Semitism that we've seen. Here he was the other day.
There's zero tolerance in Australia for hatred and for anti-Semitism. And I want any perpetrators to be hunted down and locked up. It's as simple as that.
We know this issue will, no doubt be pushed by the opposition in Parliament this week. Laura, how vulnerable do you think the PM is on this generally?
Look, I think, as Phil says and as Claire says, did he know? Should he have known? Would it have made any difference? I think that you'd have to say probably not. I think what you'd have to say about the Prime Minister in general is that he tends to, unlike the Coalition, underplay issues, not immediately call a task force into needles in strawberries or
a national cabinet meeting on this.
Whatever. If he thinks that it's been competently dealt with, he will just say so and move on. Now, unfortunately, the way politics runs these days, whatever the issue is, he tends to be seen to be undercooking things. So, what we're really talking about is reassurance, particularly for the Jewish community, who are understandably alarmed, to sort of say, look, it's okay. We're on top of this as much as we can be. Given the nature of these incidents, though, we're not looking at the sort of normal or old school terror thing. We're talking about criminal gangs who are acting for reasons that nobody's quite clear of, in the public domain. I think it's very, very difficult to sort of message about that. And it's free pickings for the Coalition to have a go at the government about it, but it's not clear, what else they should have been doing other than, messaging better.
On the return of Parliament for this next couple of weeks, could well be the last fortnight of sitting. The nature positive thing, Phil, and I know you were writing about this during the week, it's now been shelved, but what happened over the last week? Why was there a fresh attempt to try and push this through?
For viewers out there who don't understand what this is about, there was two things they were going to do: revamp the Environment Protection Act, which got kicked into the long grass about a year ago. So the government thought, we'll try and do the other part of it and establish an Environment Protection Authority. But there's so much hostility, especially in WA, because there's blowback from those botched cultural heritage laws that the state government brought in that was so overbearing they had to scrap them. And so the Premier told the Prime Minister middle of last year, look, just put a pause on nature positive, because it's just very sensitive over here. Which the PM
they
kind of did the EPBC stuff out, but
then when it came up last week, I mean, Roger Cook the other day made it. I'll just show you this. This was Roger Cook, the WA Premier, making it very clear his thoughts on it.
Now, I've got a message for those backbenchers, I think predominantly from Victoria, that think that this legislation should go up. Your standard of living, the reason why you can afford your long mac and your lattes, is because of Western Australian industry and Western Australian economy. Do not, for a moment, think that we will stand by idly and allow you to damage our economy, because ultimately it will damage your standard of living.
I had to find out what a long mac
is.
It's
a WA drink.
It's two shots with a little dollop of foam.
Look, this thing has just been caught in the hysteria of two elections in a critical state. You've got a state election in WA, and you've got a federal election where WA is going to be absolutely critical to the fortunes of both major parties. And you've got the miners just whipping it up like you wouldn't believe. They don't want any other layer of environmental scrutiny, especially an autonomous body that's not elected. So there's this massive campaign against this thing. It's impossible to have a rational argument or a rational discussion about it in this environment. Now, you've got pressures on the East Coast from Labor MPs. We saw two come up this week, Jerome Laxale and Sally Situ you in Sydney. Old mate got his state wrong. It's New South Wales, not Victoria, where the backbenchers are fired up.
Yeah.
And you've got
their long naps.
got the dynamic between Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese.
Yeah.
Tanya being the Environment Minister, who wants to land something. You know.
So a win for the West on that one. The other one is the tax credits for critical minerals. This one is pretty popular in the West, I think, despite what Peter Dutton said.
Oh, yeah.
But he's made it clear he's going to vote against this. Is that going to be a vulnerability for the Libs?
Well, probably not. It's always, the problem is always, what you didn't vote for, what you did vote for. I don't think people will really notice that they didn't vote for it, because it'll get up by all accounts. There'll be enough crossbench support for it, and that's the thing that the government really does want to focus on. I mean, it is a bit mystifying why they brought this thing back. I don't know whether it was just to sort of show that they were trying, but it does tend to look a bit scattergun that they've brought a whole heap of legislation, including electoral reform, back.
And that's, by the sounds of it, still up for a potential deal on electoral funding reform?
Yeah, it's potentially up for a deal, but, a whole heap of measures which we thought were all done and dusted. Maybe it's just they've got to have something to talk about for the next 2 weeks.
Well, the whole production tax credit, sorry to cut you off, Claire, is just about getting the opposition on the record voting against it, so they can run around WA and say they hate mining.
I think the view on electoral reform is that it's better to do a deal while you're in majority government, and it can obviously probably favour a majority than land in minority at the end of the year.
And try and do it with a crossbench. But no gambling ad reform, that one's gone, certainly in this term of Parliament, so we won't see anything on that in the next couple of weeks. Anyway, our panel, Claire Armstrong, Phil Curry, Laura Tingle, will be back in a moment with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm photographer Mike Bowers. I'm talking pictures this morning with freelance cartoonist Glen Le Lievre, and a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Strap up for a big year, I think.
Yeah.
Click, clack, front and back, Glenn. With the inflation down, the government, I think, will be looking very closely at the next time that interest rates are supposed to move.
Next month, hot on it.
Brett Lethbridge has picked up here on St Jim the Dragon Slayer, which would make this Michelle Bullock Oakenshield here.
It would, in the halls with a big pile of dragon gold.
David Rowe and his airflation drawing here. This is Captain Jim. Please keep buckled up. We might experience a little Angus Taylor.
We're going to die, we're going to die. Bang, bang, whack, 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 whack.
I do love this. He's got his hand in the Jamland jar.
It is. It's the figurative and literal cookie jar.
Yeah. Co-pilot here is Katie Gallagher, I think, in the back there. So the safety briefing will be interest rates will drop from the roof?
Attorneys will drop from the roof.
Well, Glenn, you tackled Australia Day this year by throwing a little bit of shade.
The Cabana Wars, Mike.
Yeah.
A seldom explored period of Australian history. For all the colonists out there, if you're determined to claim a patch of sand that isn't yours, Albo says it's un-Australian.
It's un-Australian, yep. I did love this David Pope. David's done the election launchpad with Peter Dutton and David Littleproud and Susan Lee. Elon, I shoehorned you into an Australia Day speech.
Well, Elon, we announced Doge too, Elon.
Any chance of a retreat, Elon?
Oh, aren't they adorable? They prairie dogs.
Martian prairie dogs, maybe.
Susan did compare the arrival of the First Fleet to the colonising of Mars.
Right.
Which is very bad news for any Martians out there.
Glenn, Peter Dutton likes to style himself as an Australian patriot, but he's shown in recent weeks he doesn't mind the American way. Matt Golding has the MAGA hat on Peter Dutton with the Australian corks. It must be Make Australia Great Again. Glenn, they say that politics is the art of the possible, but Trump's certainly testing the limits, and as is our friend David Rowe. It's executive ordure.
Everything you'd expect from a respectable business periodical like the Fin Review. Naked buttocks and annotated poop.
I do love the tattoos. He's got a Hegseth tattoo here. And
famous mad cartoonist called Bill Elder used to describe the extraneous background detail as chicken fat. And David is the king.
King of chicken fat.
Of chicken fat.
Yeah, I do love the GOP elephant here is turning on the valve that seems to be controlling the ordure.
There she blows.
Megan Herbert has picked up that there do seem to be a lot of hands inside the Trump puppetry.
Well, I thought these arms were surprisingly buff for a bunch of tech nerds and billionaires. I mean, they should be like noodles or pipe cleaners or something.
Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist Ann Telnes, who cartoons for the Washington Post, has resigned because her cartoon of the billionaires paying tribute to Trump was rejected allegedly on the directions of Bezos, the owner.
Well, the cartoonists of the world decided to do their own version of Ann's spiked drawing. This was my effort. When I posted this, I called it Kissing the Ring, or if you like, Stairway to Heaven.
Very disturbing, mate. So does the gold escalator run all the time?
Oh, 24/7.
Our good friend John Kudelka has decided to swap the conflict of political cartooning for the more friendly version of doing art. So we just wanted to thank him for his work and look at some of his greater cartoons over the past few years. Nobody Left Behind here with Albo and the band. Who's that then? Can't pay the rent. This was our 2018 Talking Pictures cartoon of the year. I wonder when Kevin's going to, and the shredding of Julia.
Doing a Banksy.
Yeah. And he kind of worked as the Tasmanian tourism minister, didn't he?
I have very demanding dishes. Only the finest.
Tasmania is awful.
Tasmania is awful. Never come here.
Well, we wish you well in your artistic endeavours, and I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David Spears.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Claire.
We touched on electoral reform tomorrow. Just before tomorrow, the Australian Electoral Commission's releasing the donations information for the 2023-2024 year.
Geez, it takes a while. It takes a while.
7 months after that financial year, the bill before Parliament at the moment includes real-time disclosure among a bunch of other limitations. Pretty good reminder of why it's important maybe to get that one done this week.
Yeah, good point. Phil?
Last December's mid-year budget review showed that cigarettes are taxed so highly now that people, it's not just quitting, but they're smoking chop, and so the revenue forecasts from tobacco tax are falling through the floor at a massive rate. Hit the Laffer curve, if you like. Tomorrow, alcohol excise goes up. The MyFO also showed the same trend is starting to start with booze now. Booze tax forecasts are falling off a cliff as well. Combine that with fuel excise, which the government's doing nothing about as EVs hit the road. Three of our most reliable tax sources for many, many, many years are suddenly looking shaky.
Laura?
Which makes me change my final observation. I'm just very conscious that Donald Trump is talking about 15% tax rates in the US. And while we don't really want to be talking about tax reform here, let alone actual policies, it appears from that interview this morning, if that happens, you know, whoever is in government in the next term is going to have to actually embrace tax changes, and let's not call it reform anymore, because everybody just closes down then.
Yeah, and look, just a final one from me. Speaking of who's going to win that election, the contest for the Chinese-Australian vote is really intensifying. Yesterday, a big Chinese New Year event in Box Hill in Melbourne, Keith Wallahan's seat. Both leaders were there, Peter Dutton, Anthony Albanese. Libs are confident that it's not going to come back as much as they lost at the last election under Scott Morrison, but it's coming back somewhat, particularly there in Victoria. Thank you all very much for joining us on the first show of the year. Look forward to more chats in the weeks and months ahead. Finally, well, Mike Bowers might have some new cartoonists to consider for Talking Pictures this year. We'll leave you with Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton's artistic impressions of each other. Thanks for watching.
This is Peter Dutton by Anthony Albanese.
That's impressive, and that really sums up the PM's total skill set there. That's great. That's great.
He missed your glasses.
Yeah, no, he's an overachiever.
Would you like to respond?
What do you think? This is Copacabana.
Oh.
This is a retirement village.
Will you sign it, please?
We like it. Yeah.
Yep. To Elbow, happy retirement. Peter Dutton.
What do you think?
You know what?
You like
It's polite, but also kicks him in the balls.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.